and she never governs wisely.
The colonies are not to be emancipated.
All men are created equal. Victory or death.
After the Revolution's beginnings in 1775 and 1776, the middle years brought the American rebels the knowledge that their struggle for independence would not be a quick and simple war. At the same time, Washington's army encountered one British army. Generals Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates fought another in the north. On the wild American frontier, brutal fighting for different goals with different enemies raged. And in Europe, the mightiest nations on earth began to see a preoccupied, drained Britain as an easy target. The dogs of war had been unleashed, and no one knew how to harness them again.
The Battle of Trenton is a part of one of the most magnificent campaigns of the American Revolution. The 10 days at Christmas, 1776, if Washington had done nothing before or nothing after, those 10 days would have guaranteed him a spot in all of our history books.
Necessity, dire necessity, will, nay must, justify my attack. Victory or death. George Washington before Trenton.
On Christmas night of 1776, Washington led 2,400 of his dwindling army to the banks of the Delaware River. He planned to cross the river and attack the enemy-held town of Trenton, New Jersey. His men were Army regulars, not militia. By now, Washington was convinced that only a standing army could meet and defeat trained British forces, an army, he said, that would look the enemy in the face.
It is fearfully cold and raw, and a snowstorm setting in. The wind is northeast and beats in the faces of the men. It will be a terrible night for the soldiers who have no shoes. Some of them have tied old rags around their feet. Others are barefoot, but I have not heard a man complain. Colonel John Fitzgerald, Christmas, 1776.
John Glover's Marbleheaders, the same group that saved Washington's army through a daring nighttime evacuation from Brooklyn to Manhattan just 4 months earlier, saw to the dangerous task of ferrying the Continentals across the icy Delaware.
Glover's men have had a hard time to force the boats through the floating ice with the snow drifting in their faces. I have never seen Washington so determined as he is now. He is calm and collected, but very determined. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
The crossing took longer than expected. They still had 9 hard miles to cover in order to surprise the enemy before dawn. Surprise was possible in no small part because of the work of John Honeyman, a spy of Washington's who had infiltrated the British-paid German mercenaries, commonly called Hessians.
Throughout the war, I should add, Washington was his own spy master. He ran all kinds of spy rings inside the British Army and inside the British cities like New York and Philadelphia. But Trenton was his masterpiece. And Honeyman went into Trenton and befriended the German commander. His name was Johann Rall. And Honeyman told Rall, "Oh, I've been over on the other side of Delaware. Washington's army is falling apart. There's nothing left. He's gone. You know, there's nothing. Don't worry about the Americans. Have another drink, Colonel," and so forth. Honeyman, meanwhile, would get back to Washington and give him a complete breakdown of every move the Hessians were making, the disposition of all their sentries, the whole operation of this Hessian outpost there at Trenton.
At 7:30 in the morning, in a sleet storm, the American forces surprised the Hessians, still groggy from their Christmas festivities.
There are probably no troops, British, Hessian, or Loyalists, that would have stood against the Americans at Trenton. They were caught totally by surprise. They were disorganized, and they really didn't know what was going on. Plus, the weather was bad, and it was hard to fire their muskets.
The Hessian commander, spent after a Christmas night of drinking and gambling, tried to rally his troops.
We could hear him shouting in German, "My brave soldiers, advance!" His men were frightened and confused, for our men were firing upon them from fences and houses, and they were falling fast. It was not long before Rall tumbled from his horse, and his soldiers threw down their guns and gave themselves up as prisoners. Colonel John Fitzgerald.
Mortally wounded, Rall surrendered his sword to Washington. The American commander took 900 Hessian prisoners.
This was the victory that Americans had to have in order to turn the whole thing around. It went through the spirited American colonies like an electric shock. You know, all the way from Carolina to Boston, the news went out that we'd won one, finally.
4 days after Trenton, Washington made an emotional appeal to the disintegrating core of his army, the Continental Regulars, who had actually enlisted for service, rather than simply volunteering as militiamen. For many, their one-year enlistment would end in 2 days, with the new year.
My brave fellows, you have done all I asked you to do and more than could be reasonably expected. But your country is at stake, your wives, your houses, and all that you hold dear. You have worn yourselves out with fatigues and hardships, but we know not how to spare you. If you will consent to stay only 1 month longer, you will render that service to the cause of liberty and to your country, which you probably never can do under any other circumstances. The present is emphatically the crisis which is to decide our destiny. George Washington before Princeton.
After the speech, 200 volunteers stepped forward to renew their enlistments. Within days, they would see battle again, as Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis pursued them from New York.
The British came at him with every man they could find. They had about 10,000 men, and they had him pinned against the bank of the Delaware, and it looked like it was all over. And Cornwallis, the British commander, said, "Oh, we won't attack tonight. We'll finish them off tomorrow morning." Washington left all the campfires of his army blazing and left like 3 men to throw wood on the fire, and he took his army and he marched around the British flank.
Again, Washington had escaped the much larger British force, but his army met a smaller British force here at Princeton. The weary Continentals fell into retreat at the attack of the British line.
Washington appeared in front of the American army, riding towards those of us who were retreating, and exclaimed, "Parade with us, my brave fellows. There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." a Continental Sergeant at Princeton.
I shall never forget what I felt at Princeton on his account. When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field and his important life hanging, as it were, by a single hair with 1,000 deaths flying around him. Believe me, I thought not of myself. A Pennsylvania volunteer.
As he would do countless times in battle, Washington rallied his troops by virtue of his own bravery. Throughout the war, his life seemed charmed.
He had a lot of physical courage. He almost believed that he was invulnerable to bullets. He had 3 horses shot out from under him. He had bullet holes in his clothes. His hat was shot away, but he was never himself scratched once by a bullet or a bayonet. And he exposed himself constantly.
Several months earlier in New York, British buglers sounded a fox hunting tune as they pursued Washington and his fleeing army. Still smarting from the insult, Washington now shouted, "It's a fine day for a fox chase, my boys," and spurred his horse after the retreating redcoats. As at Trenton, the British were routed. Washington didn't linger to savor his second victory in 9 days. Instead, he rushed his army into winter quarters in the mountains near Morristown, New Jersey.
You look at the map, from that location, he would have been astride or on the flank of the lines of communication, supply lines of the British leading across the state of New Jersey. The British could not get at him back in those mountains in the winter with an army in that day and age, so they had no choice but to leave New Jersey. So by winning 2 battles, very small battles really in terms of the numbers of soldiers engaged on either side, and by an operational maneuver, he wedged, or outgeneraled, if you will, the British completely out of New Jersey. And so when the campaigning ended, the British had New York City. That's all they had to show for the largest expeditionary force they ever had sent anywhere for an entire year of campaigning.
General William Howe seemed in no hurry to retaliate for the defeats at Trenton and Princeton. After all, he controlled the city of New York and was enjoying an affair with one of the most attractive women in America, Elizabeth Loring, the wife of his loyalist commissary of prisoners, Joshua Loring. Francis Hopkinson, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, would soon poke fun at Howe with a clever verse.
Sir William, he, snug as a flea, lay all this time a-snoring, nor dreamed of harm as he lay warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. Francis Hopkinson.
Finally, Sir William made his move. From New York, he sailed with more than 15,000 men south, then up the Chesapeake Bay. He obviously planned to take the largest city in America, Philadelphia. The guns of Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer blocked an easier entry up the Delaware River into the rebel capital. With his Chesapeake Bay approach, Howe would have to cross overland for 50 miles to reach the city. On the 24th of August, 1777, Washington marched his own army through Philadelphia to intercept the enemy.
4 regiments of light horse, 4 grand divisions of the army and the artillery marched 12 deep and yet took up above 2 hours in passing by. We have now an army well appointed between us and Mr. Howe. John Adams.
A new member of that army was a 19-year-old major general from France who had never seen a musket fired in battle. His name was Marie-Joseph Paul-Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette.
Lafayette is simply irresistible. He's such an idealist. Jefferson later said that he had a canine appetite for fame. And somebody else said that he was a man of only one idea. But fortunately for him, it was the idea of the century, namely liberty. Washington loved this guy. He treated him like a son and also like a younger brother. throughout the whole war.
Washington was basically aggressive and combative by nature, so he came down to contest Howe's advance against Philadelphia. And he did so at Brandywine on September the 11th. And there his army fought pretty well, but it was outflanked. Washington always seemed to have a problem protecting his flanks.
There was a most infernal fire of cannon and musketry, most incessant shouting. Incline to the right, incline to the left, halt, charge. The balls ploughing up the ground, the trees cracking over one's head, the leaves falling as in autumn by the grape shot. The action was brilliant. Mr. Washington retreated, that is, ran away, and Mr. Howe remained master of the field. A British officer at Brandywine.
In his first battle, Lafayette was wounded. The next day, he wrote his young wife in France.
Dear heart, Messieurs les Anglais wounded me slightly in the leg, but it is nothing, for the ball did not touch bone or nerve.
Others weren't so lucky. Joseph Townsend, a young Quaker, described the field of combat after the battle.
Awful was the scene to behold. Such a number of fellow human beings lying together, severely wounded and some mortally. A few dead, but a small proportion of them, considering the immense quantity of powder and ball that had been discharged. It was now time for the surgeons to exert themselves.
Falling into the hands of a Revolutionary War surgeon was a mixed blessing at best. With doctors working without antiseptics or anesthetics and guided by fallacious concepts, even minor surgeries became life-threatening. The sickness and disease that ran rampant through the encampments claimed many more lives in the Revolutionary War than did actual combat. Howe followed up his victory at Brandywine with a surprise nighttime attack of Pennsylvania General Anthony Wayne's division at nearby Paoli. Relying solely on the British bayonet, the raid turned into a slaughter. 6 days later, Howe sent Lord Charles Cornwallis into Philadelphia in triumph.
At about 11 o'clock a.m., Lord Cornwallis with his division of the British and auxiliary troops amounting to about 3,000 marched into this city. To the great relief of the inhabitants who have too long suffered the yoke of arbitrary power, and who testified their approbation of the arrival of the troops by the loudest acclamations of joy. Robert Morton, Philadelphia Loyalist.
Philadelphia had fallen to the British. Soon, Fort Mifflin, which guarded the Delaware River, would fall, opening a British sea route to the principal American city. But the American Congress had slipped out of Philadelphia and was already in session in nearby York.
As the war developed, it was difficult for professional generals to realize that the kind of victory which would have been decisive in European terms, capturing the enemy's major cities, knocking out his major field army, something which would certainly in a European context have brought the enemy to negotiate to a political settlement, and that of course is what they were wanting in America. It turned out that even capturing all the major cities in America did not, in fact, bring the rebels to terms. And certainly, in any conventional terms, Sir William Howe came very near to total victory, but not quite near enough.
Washington was spoiling for another fight. And in the first week of October, he attacked a large British outpost, some 8 to 10 miles from the city at the old settlement called Germantown.
Washington attempted an elaborate strategy that involved several columns converging in the middle of the night. At first, the Americans gained the upper hand and drove the British forward. But then they passed the large stone mansion of the Chew family, Clifton. British soldiers occupied the mansion, and Washington was unsure of how to handle the situation. In an army where a bookseller could quickly become a trusted field commander,
General Henry Knox offered his opinion.
It would be unmilitary to leave a castle in our rear, Henry Knox.
The rebels drained their resources trying to capture Clifton. Other rebel troops became so confused by the fog and smoke of the battle that they began firing on each other.
Some of the men unadvisedly called out that their ammunition was spent. The enemy were so near that they overheard them when they first made a stand, and then returned upon our people who, for want of ammunition and reinforcements, were obliged to retreat, which ultimately resulted in the rout of the whole army. Joseph Plum Martin, Continental soldier.
Our loss was about 1,000 men. But of the missing, many, I dare say, took advantage of the time and deserted. In a word, it was a bloody day. George Washington.
After Germantown, Howe settled into Philadelphia for the winter. Benjamin Franklin suggested that Howe didn't occupy Philadelphia, but that Philadelphia occupied Howe.
Howe became obsessed with the social life of the city. He attended balls, the theater. He consorted with the Loyalist population. There were elegant dinners and all kinds of other gala activities.
You can have no idea of the life of continued amusement I live in. I can scarcely have a moment to myself. And most elegantly am I dressed for a ball this evening at Smith's, where we have one every Thursday. No loss for partners. Even I am engaged to 7 different gentlemen. For you must know, 'tis a fixed rule never to dance but 2 dances at a time with the same person. Rebecca Franks, Philadelphia Loyalist.
Howe had decided not to lead the next season's campaign and had requested permission to resign his command from Lord George Germain, the minister responsible for the American War in London. When his resignation was accepted, a witty, artistic young captain named John Andre planned a farewell gala for him called a Mischianza. It would be one of the most lavish celebrations ever held on American soil. Fireworks, decorated barges on the river, and medieval jousts held the guests' attention until midnight. They would dance until dawn. Captain Andre had designed the entire grand affair, even sketching countless details like this hat for a young Loyalist beauty named Peggy Shippen. 2 years later, Andre and Shippen both would be intimately involved with Benedict Arnold in the most notorious treason in American history. While the British entered their festive winter in Philadelphia, Washington's threadbare army prepared for a bitter winter here at Valley Forge.
You might have tracked the army from White Marsh to Valley Forge by the blood of their feet. George Washington.
Here all is confusion, smoke and cold, hunger and filthiness. A pox on my bad luck. There comes a bowl of beef soup full of burnt leaves and dirt, sickish enough to make a Hector spew. Away with it, boys. I'll live like a comedian upon air. Albigence Waldo.
During the Valley Forge winter, 2,500 of Washington's men would die from disease and the cold. But by spring, the nature of America's War of Independence would be radically changed because of events that had recently occurred here in upper New York State, near the town of Saratoga.
The Hudson is the nexus of the northern and southern colonies, a kind of key to the whole continent, as it is a passage to Canada, to the Great Lakes, and to all the Indian nations. No effort to secure it ought to be omitted. John Adams.
There's a chain of events, and Benedict Arnold is involved in that entire chain in 75, 76, and 77 that caused us eventually to win our independence.
In late 1775, Benedict Arnold completed his epic starvation march to Quebec. On New Year's Eve of that year, he and General Richard Montgomery tried to take the fortress city. When that attempt failed, he laid siege to the city with his small army. But by early July of 1776, British commander Sir Guy Carleton had forced the Americans to give up their siege of Quebec. That city, the key to Canada, lay securely in British hands.
The junction of the Canadians with the colonies, an object which brought us into this country, is now at an end. Let us quit them and secure our own country before it is too late. These arguments are not urged by fear for my personal safety. I am content to be the last man who quits this country and fall so that my country rise. But let us not fall altogether. Benedict Arnold, June 1776.
Arnold knew that the Hudson River was the most strategic waterway in America.
Part of the general British strategy of the day was to seize the line of the Hudson and cut off New England from the middle colonies, and then, of course, reduce New England, punish it, and destroy what was believed to be the core of the rebellion.
Carleton pursued the retreating Americans from Quebec to St. John's, just north of the 100-mile-long Lake Champlain. From the lake, he could access the Hudson and join forces with Sir William Howe in New York City. But he met an obstacle on the lake, Benedict Arnold.
One of Arnold's great victories was not as a general, but as an admiral. It was kind of a backwoods arms race that took place. Any ships there had to be built there. So at the northern end of the lake, the British were busy building warships, schooners and barges for mortars and so forth. And at the southern end, Arnold supervised the construction of the American fleet.
The British were forced to disassemble warships on the St. Lawrence, carry the pieces to Lake Champlain, and reassemble them there. The task would occupy them through the summer into the fall. Meanwhile, Arnold was building his navy from scratch. It would be far more humble and far less professional than the British force.
When you ask for a frigate, they give you a raft. Ask for sailors, they give you tavern waiters. And if you want breeches, they give you a vest. Benedict Arnold, August 1776.
Arnold realized he was so outgunned that the best he could get would be a delaying action, a sort of a glorious defeat. He finished his fleet and sailed north, came off Valcour Island. The British, in the meantime, came south. Arnold chose, rather than to confront them, to extend his fleet from Valcour Island to the shore in a very narrow area. They could only get a few ships at a time where he was in his position, so his position equalized the strength between the British and the American fleets.
We suffered much for want of seamen and gunners. I was obliged myself to point most of the guns on board the Congress, which I believe did good execution. Benedict Arnold.
In a day-long battle on October 11th, Arnold's scrapped-together navy fought the British to a draw. But he knew his navy would be crushed if it remained in Valcour Bay. That night, his small fleet slipped through a gap in the British line. Arnold knew that the British could now outsail him and outgun him on the open lake.
He ran his ships aground, burned them, and he made a point of leaving the American flag flying so it was not a surrender, and escaped with his remaining sailors, who were really soldiers, overland back down to Fort Ticonderoga.
With winter on the way, Guy Carleton chose to return to Quebec rather than push his attack down the Hudson to New York. Arnold's action on Lake Champlain had delayed the decisive British movement for a year. the British refused to give up their strategy of a northern invasion by way of the Hudson. British General Johnny Burgoyne had written a plan of conquest that focused on controlling that river. And in the summer of 1777, while Washington occupied Howe in the Philadelphia area, he set out from Fort St. John's, Canada, to execute it. His army of over 9,000 consisted of British regulars, German troops, loyalists who had fled to Canada, and American Indian allies. Burgoyne himself traveled with 30 carts of personal belongings, a lavish supply of wine and champagne, and a very attractive loyalist mistress. Another woman, Madame Frederica von Riedesel, and her 3 small children traveled with the army. She was the wife of the German commander, Major General Baron von Riedesel, and wrote some of the most sensitive and accurate observations of the campaign.
General Burgoyne spent half of his nights in singing and drinking and diverting himself with his mistress, who was as fond of champagne as himself. Madame Frederica von Riedesel.
Burgoyne was a playboy, a socialite, a writer of plays, an actor, and he was perpetually in debt. The British writer Horace Walpole said that he had more sail than ballast, which means that he had more dash and confidence and prudence.
General Burgoyne was idolized by the army, his orders appearing more like recommending subordination than enforcing it. He was the soldier's friend. Grenadier Lieutenant William Digby.
Although he retained the confidence of his troops to a remarkable extent, in no other sense, it seems to me, could you describe him as a good commander.
Burgoyne's first obstacle was the Gibraltar of the North, Fort Ticonderoga. Since Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had taken the fort from the British in May of 1775, it had remained in rebel hands for over 2 years, under the command of Arthur Sinclair. When Burgoyne placed artillery on nearby Mount Defiance, the rebels knew he could rain destruction on the fort at will.
St. Clair was forced into making a decision. Should he try and defend Ticonderoga with an insufficient force, or should he basically evacuate the fort, save those Continental troops to fight another day? And in fact, they did. The 10 Continental regiments that were evacuated from Ticonderoga ended up going in the battles of Saratoga in September and October of 1777.
Albany, New York was Burgoyne's goal. There, according to his plan, he would meet 2 other British armies, Mary St. Leger's smaller force coming from the west, and William Howe's larger force coming up the Hudson from the south. In reality, he would meet disaster at Saratoga. For Mary St. Leger's eastbound army, the trouble started when they reached Fort Stanwix and met tough rebel resistance. With his Indian and Loyalist allies, he laid siege to the fort. A relief column coming to his aid met fierce resistance at the Battle of Oriskany.
Easily more than 50% of the male white population of Tryon County were involved in the Battle of Oriskany, trying to kill each other on the Loyalist side or on the Whig or rebel side. Many historians have described the Battle of Oriskany in terms of the number of combatants involved as probably one of the bloodiest in American history.
Once again, Benedict Arnold found an important role to play in the struggle. He led another party to relieve the rebels trapped by the siege of Fort Stanwix. But before he arrived, Arnold sent the half-witted Han Yost, a man St. Leger's Indians considered to be holy, to tell them that Arnold's army was huge.
In fact, the tradition says that he described it as numerous as the leaves on the trees. Over half of St. Leger's force was composed of Native Americans. And in fact, even before Benedict Arnold arrived here to relieve the siege, St. Leger had abandoned the siege because of the defection of large numbers of his Native American forces.
Fort Stanwix had utterly defeated St. Leger. He would be of no help to Burgoyne, who had faced his own trials, cutting his way through dense, humid, mosquito-plagued New York forest. Bad news had come from Sir Henry Clinton, Howe's second in command. The letter read like nonsense, but with an hourglass-shaped mask placed over the text, Burgoyne could read the secret message.
Sir W. Howe is gone to the Chesapeake Bay with the greatest part of the army. I hear he has landed, but am not certain. I am left to command here with too small a force to make any effectual diversion in your favor.
Shortly after receiving the devastating news that Howe's main army would probably not join him in Albany, a detachment of Burgoyne's troops met rebel militia near Bennington, Vermont, an area known as the Hampshire Grants.
That force was literally almost annihilated. It was either wounded, killed, or captured almost entirely. The relief column sent out to reinforce it was stopped dead in the water. This was a major setback for Burgoyne's army, and in fact, the first major setback of the campaign with regard to his advance on Albany.
We do not know how many we have killed. One of our scouts found, the beginning of this week, 26 of the enemy lying dead in the woods. They stank so they could not bury them. The wounded Hessians die 3 or 4 in a day. They're all in the Bennington Meeting House, which smells so it is enough to kill anyone to be in it. Peter Clark, farmer, militiaman.
The Hampshire Grants, a country unpeopled and almost unknown in the last war, now abounds in the most active and rebellious race on the continent. General Johnny Burgoyne, fall 1777.
Just a week after the Battle of Bennington, Burgoyne learned of Barry St. Leger's failure at Fort Stanwix. But without St. Leger, and especially without Howe, Burgoyne still decided to push his weary and casualty-ridden army on to Saratoga, and then Albany. It was a decision on which the fate of the war would hinge. When General John Burgoyne commanded his army across the Hudson and on to Albany, he knew that he would at last meet the bulk of the Northern American army. They waited on the other side, secure in the fortified highlands of Bemis Heights. There were 7,000 of them, under the command of General Horatio Gates, once a major in the British Army, now a supporter of the rebel cause. Subordinate to Gates was General Benedict Arnold. On September 19th, the two great armies met. Daniel Morgan's riflemen fired the opening volley in the first of the two battles of Freeman's Farm, shortened by history to Saratoga.
There was a lot of propaganda associated with the American riflemen. The British feared them as the greatest widowmakers in North America.
The spiraled grooves in the rifle's barrel gave bullets an aerodynamic spin, giving the weapon a much greater range and accuracy than the smooth-bore musket. But because it was designed as a civilian hunting weapon, the rifle did not accept the bayonet.
The success of Morgan's troops in the battles of Saratoga was mainly due to the fact that Morgan commanded not only a corps of select riflemen, but also a battalion of light infantry under Henry Dearborn. This light infantry was equipped with muskets and bayonets, and every time that the riflemen got themselves in trouble, which was very frequently, they could run behind this line of Dearborn's battalion of light infantry and get themselves saved from being driven off the field.
Both armies seemed determined to conquer or die, one continual blaze without any intermission till dark, when by consent of both parties, it ceased. General John Glover.
The first battle of Freeman's Farm cost Burgoyne 600 men. The rebel army lost half as many. British Lieutenant Thomas Anbury helped bury the bodies of his comrades.
No other distinction is paid to officer or soldier than that the officers are put in a hole by themselves. Our army abounded with young officers, and in the course of this unpleasant duty, 3 of the 20th Regiment were interred together, the age of the eldest not exceeding 17. Lieutenant Thomas Anbury.
Now Burgoyne waited, hanging his hopes on a further correspondence he had just received from Henry Clinton.
If you think 2,000 men can assist you effectually, I will make a push at Fort Montgomery in about 10 days. I expect reinforcements every day. Sir Henry Clinton, letter of September 12th.
Burgoyne's Indian allies and many of his German mercenaries were deserting him. Supplies were short. Food was scarce. His men were sick.
At no time did the Jews await the coming of the Messiah with greater expectancy than we awaited the coming of General Clinton, a German soldier at Freeman's Farm.
Gates tried to anticipate Burgoyne's next move.
Perhaps his despair may dictate to him to risk all upon one throw. He is an old gamester and in his time has seen many chances. General Horatio Gates.
Burgoyne struck on October 7th. Again, his men were met by Morgan's sharpshooters. Gates had refused to give Benedict Arnold command of troops. Like so many others, he disliked Arnold's abrasive style and distrusted him.
No man shall keep me in my tent today. If I am without command, I will fight in the ranks. But the soldiers, God bless them, will follow my lead. Benedict Arnold.
Arnold defied Gates, his commanding officer, and joined the Second Battle of Freeman's Farm. The talented field general quickly identified Burgoyne's key strategic position, the Bremen Redoubt.
Without an actual command, he rides out onto the field of battle, takes command of troops that are attacking the Bremen Redoubt, and ultimately captures that particular redoubt. Arnold was a brilliant tactical commander, and his subsequent treason doesn't necessarily negate that.
A musket ball smashed Arnold's thigh, but not before he had turned the battle for the Americans.
Benedict Arnold is one of the great enigmas in American history. If he had been killed in 1777, the Battle of Saratoga, when he penetrated the British lines, if that musket ball that had shattered his thigh, if that had gone into his heart instead, he would be remembered today as one of the greatest heroes in the pantheon of American heroes.
General Johnny Burgoyne exposed himself to enemy fire throughout the battle, rallying his men. Bullets or musket balls tore his hat and uniform, but he was never hit. However, Simon Fraser, one of his fellow generals, fell to the accuracy of a Morgan rifleman, Timothy Murphy.
General Fraser was the British general who was covering General Burgoyne's retreat. And in the process of doing this, he exposed himself personally to the rifleman. And at 300 yards, Timothy Murphy was given the credit for mortally wounding General Fraser.
They brought Fraser to the house where Frederica von Riedesel was waiting out the battle. She had expected to dine with him that evening.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they brought to me upon a litter poor General Fraser. Our dining table, which was already spread, was taken away, and in its place they fixed up a bed for the general. The ball had gone through his bowels. I heard him often amidst his groans exclaim, "Oh, fatal ambition, poor General Burgoyne, my poor wife." Madame Frederica von Riedesel.
Fraser died the next morning at 8 o'clock. He was one of 600 men from Burgoyne's army who had been killed, wounded, or were missing during the Second Battle of Freeman's Farm. That night, Burgoyne began his retreat. For the next several days, the Americans hounded his limping army. Then, it was over.
Our retreat had been cut off. A cessation of hostilities took place, and my husband, who was thoroughly worn out, was able for the first time in a long while to lie down upon a bed. Madame Frederica von Riedesal.
Burgoyne surrendered his sword and his army to Gates on October 17th, 1777. When the two men met, General Johnny said,
"The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner."
Then they and the other principal officers retired to Gates' tent to dine on meats and New England rum. General Benedict Arnold was absent, recuperating from his leg wound. The next time he would see battle, he would be on the side of the British.
You'd have to say that Saratoga was Arnold's high water mark. It was the culmination of 3 years of effort on his part, constantly exposing himself in battle, of courageous efforts from his march up the Kennebec, the seizure of Ticonderoga, his fighting, his work on Champlain, all of that, it culminated in his final take charge effort that sealed the defeat of Burgoyne and led to Burgoyne's surrender, which led to the French coming in the war, which inevitably led to the eventual British defeat.
For the revolutionary generation, the journey towards independence was a long one, measured in years, not months. After Saratoga, more than enough time remained for Benedict Arnold to plan the most famous treason in American history, and thus to fall from celebrated heroism to despised villainy.